what's the address of the emergency?
Hello, there's a man lying here. He does not appear to be breathing.
The victim appeared to have been shot multiple times.
Why would someone take my papa's life?
We had some surveillance video.
And then you can see the pickup.
We were very concerned that we had a serial shooter out there.
It almost appeared as if he's out hunting people.
Billy Knoll is a 65-year-old military veteran enjoying his retirement.
Billy was my older brother. I like to say he was the go-to guy. If you needed anything, you wanted anything, he would give you the shirt off his back. Billy had 3 children and 5 grandchildren. He lived for his children. You know, that's what he woke up to do.
My grandfather's always been the one solid male figure in me, my sister, and my brother's life that was always there.
I moved in with Billy in 2012. My kids had grown, and so I called him and said, "Can I come stay with you?" And he said, "Yeah, come in, stay as long as you want." I really loved the opportunity to be there, especially when he was diagnosed with cancer. He didn't accept help. You know, he'd be crawling on the floor before he asked for help. But I was glad I was able to be there during that time.
Billy finishes his cancer treatment in May 2015. Mary moves out to make room for Sadie and her family to move in.
He never made me feel like it was a bad idea, but the house wasn't big enough for everybody, so I moved out.
He finally finished his chemo treatment, and everything was going well, and we all celebrated.
He always walked to help him sleep. He walked to think. And he would just walk for hours.
He just couldn't sleep that night. We as a family 100% believe that that's what was going on. He had his music in and everything.
What's the address of the emergency?
Hello, there's a man lying here on the corner of First and St. Louis. He does not appear to be breathing, and he is bleeding uncontrollably.
Okay, we're gonna get help on the way. Hold on 1 second for me. Do you know why he's bleeding?
No, I have no idea. I just saw him lying here on the sidewalk as I was driving by, and I thought I'd pull over to see if he's doing okay, and I don't know what to do. I'm just a little freaked out right now.
Okay. All right, we do have help on the way.
On June 3rd of 2015, I was the on-call investigator for the city of Loveland. I was paged to contact the street supervisor in reference to a death investigation at the corner of First and St. Louis in Loveland. The 911 call was placed by a gentleman who was driving through the area. He was coming home from work, and he saw a person lying on the northwest corner of First and St. Louis. He stopped to check on that person and found him to be unresponsive and bleeding. The on-call duty supervisor told me over the phone that the victim appeared to have been shot multiple times. It appeared, based on the way he was clothed, at the time, it appeared that maybe he was just out for a walk. The victim was identified by a Colorado driver's license that he had in his wallet. And on that driver's license is his full name, William Knoll. So when I arrived on scene that evening, one of my officers had located what's called a shot cup that comes from a shotgun lying close to the victim. And that got us looking into the possibility that the victim was shot with a shotgun.
Hello, this is Mary Knoll.
I got a call early in the morning from Billy's son, and he told me on the phone, and it was disbelief. All of our lives changed in that instant. In a fire or a flood, when a river changes course, nothing's the same, ever.
I remember I felt disoriented because I was like in the middle of sleeping, and my mom was crying and crying, and she's like, "Papa's gone, Papa's gone." I was just like, "What do you mean? Like, where did he go?" And she's like, "No, Papa died. Papa was shot and killed right next to his house." And just that sentence, it just like, you know, doesn't even make sense. Why would someone out of everybody take my Papa's life?
The victim himself didn't appear to have been robbed. He was listening to something on his phone. He had earbuds in, glasses on, hat on. The shot cup was located just a little north of the victim. And there was also one pellet hole in the side of the building, which would have been just north of the victim. Obviously, this type of crime in Loveland is not a normal one. If we did have a suspect that was randomly shooting people, we knew that was a major concern for us. And that was due to the fact that there were other random shootings in the area in the last several months.
In April 2015, an unknown gunman shot 20-year-old Corey Romero following a road traffic accident in Fort Collins. Corey survived her wound. In May 2015, 47-year-old John Jacoby was shot and killed while riding his bicycle in Windsor. Loveland PD reaches out to the Northern Colorado Shooting Task Force after what appears to be a third random shooting in as many months.
Detective Kamoski asked if I would go through the scene with him to see if there were any similarities.
Thanks for coming.
We were able to find out fairly quickly that there was no connection between either of the three victims, which stood out in our minds that it was somebody randomly going around shooting at people, which was concerning, to say the least.
Can you tell me what you saw earlier this evening?
I had an officer who found a witness down the street. The witness was in her home, actually in her bathroom at the time, and her window faces North St. Louis, which would be the road that goes north out of the intersection. She hears a loud noise, which she contributes to being a gunshot. Prompts her to look out the window, and she sees what she describes as an older style pickup truck traveling northbound at a high rate of speed. It was a long bed, single cab. She also thought that it was two-toned and that it sounded loud, like maybe it had a muffler problem. Once my officers canvassed the area, there was a liquor store on the southeast corner of the intersection, and one of my officers observed several cameras on the outside of the building. The owner of that business was contacted. and he was able to show us his surveillance video. We were hoping that we would capture the actual crime as it occurred, which would be obviously invaluable to us.
Play me the footage from around 10:30 p.m.
The surveillance video was a little grainy. There wasn't a lot of detail.
Pause it there.
At 10:41, we see Mr. Knoll walking west on First Street.
Play that section again, please.
He approaches the crosswalk area of the intersection and then goes out of frame.
Hold it. Show me that again.
So approximately 30 seconds after Mr. Knoll leaves the frame of the video, you can see a pickup come into frame.
Again, please.
The vehicle was traveling at a slower rate of speed than the other vehicles going through the intersection.
Okay, punch in there.
It also was a single-cabbed, long-bed, older-looking truck, and that matched what the witness had told us.
But it does look like a older model or a 70s model GMC Chevy type pickup. We kept focusing and seeing what we believed were some rust spots on the driver's door. Obviously, it matched up with the time that Mr. Knoll was shot. You can see the pickup in question going westbound on First Street just as Mr. Knoll is ready to cross the street.
Hold on, that's the same truck from earlier.
Show me that again, please.
About a minute later, you can see the same pickup come back into frame, and then the pickup turns north onto St. Louis.
Why would that truck double back so soon?
He goes up 3 or 4 blocks and takes some side streets. Became significant because we were able to get more witness information that they heard a vehicle with a loud engine come down their street.
When we see the vehicle, which we believe is the same vehicle twice, at a close proximity of time when the actual murder occurs, that was highly significant for us, and that really started to get us to think that this vehicle was possibly involved.
We put out a be on the lookout for a Chevrolet or GMC pickup truck. We were able to give a pretty good description of the vehicle on the be on the lookout to other law enforcement agencies.
The following day, we put out a press release. We were looking for, a possibility that somebody out there would know something or seen something. I was aware of the fact that there was the 2 other shootings. One of them, the victim died. The other one, I knew miraculously survived her injuries. And based on the fact that up until this point in my investigation, I hadn't been able to establish a motive, it was natural for me to start to consider the fact that these incidents could be tied together.
As the task force investigates possible links between the shootings, the results from Billy's autopsy come through.
On June 7th, we were told that Mr. Knoll had died of a shotgun wound to his upper torso. It was from a 12-gauge shotgun.
We were able to determine through some testing of similar shotgun shells, the discharge site and the pattern that it produced, that it was a distance of probably between 22 and 27 foot, which would have put the shooters basically in the middle of First Street. Plausible that it came from a vehicle because of a downward angle.
The comparisons to the other two shootings were, we believe those victims were shot from a moving vehicle. We believe Mr. Knoll was shot from a moving vehicle.
So based off of the video that we had and the one eyewitness that we had, the next investigative part of the case would be to try and find 73 to 79 years GM pickups. So we were able to access the Colorado Division of Motor Vehicles database and ask for that particular range of year, style of pickup, and make of pickup. We then are given a list of those vehicles that would match that criteria. Unfortunately, that was thousands and thousands and thousands of vehicles. There was anywhere from 30 to 50 people working every day on the case, and there was probably 12 to 15 of us that would go out every day and look for potential suspect vehicles.
While investigators look for the vintage truck, Detective Kamoski receives information about another shooting.
I get a phone call from Mr. Chronister.
Detective Kamoski speaking.
Mr. Chronister reports to me that approximately 10 minutes prior to the time that Mr. Knoll was shot and killed, he had been shot at by an unknown person driving a orange or red colored pickup truck.
Mr. Chronister was leaving a bar on the north side of Berthoud. He observed a pickup that was parked on the side of the road with its lights out. As he turned left, the pickup turned on its headlights and began to pursue him. He went to the area of his residence. He said the pickup was still very, very close to him. Just as he was turning left at 10:33 p.m., he heard what he believed to be a gunshot. He reached and felt his back to make sure he had not been hit, and that he immediately went home.
Thank you very much.
It was a huge concern to us to find out that there could be a second shooting. Potentially, I had a suspect that was out randomly shooting people, and in a way, for me, it almost appeared as if he's out hunting people. We canvassed that whole route in which Mr. Chronister took all the way up until the time that he was shot at. And we were able to locate a surveillance video camera. Unfortunately, the surveillance video is from the top of a roof of a Walmart. It was pretty far away.
Investigators review the CCTV footage at the police department.
Play me the footage from June 3rd, 10:30 p.m.
We were hoping we would be able to see license plates and things like better description of the vehicle and possibly even who's driving the vehicle.
The security camera is such a distance away that the vehicles that are traveling on the roadway that we're interested in are fairly small. So we knew right away we weren't going to be able to get a lot of detail. You can see in the video that you can make out what appears to be a motorcycle traveling northbound on Denver Avenue. You can see a vehicle directly behind that motorcycle. Potentially could be a huge piece of evidence. So at approximately 10:33 p.m., we see what we believe is Mr. Chronister on his motorcycle, and then directly behind him, we see the suspect vehicle.
Rewind 10 seconds and play it back again.
As the two vehicles travel northbound and get closer to the intersection of Denver Avenue and Eisenhower Boulevard, it becomes a bit more lit.
Stop there. Zoom in, please.
And that's where we get our first glimpse that you can see the color of it, which appears to be either a red or an orange. One of my detectives received a call from a gentleman who lived 3 blocks north of the shooting location. He happened to be up that night and reports that he gets a very good look at the vehicle as it goes by. So that witness was brought to the police department. While I'm doing an interview with him, I drew a pickup truck as he described it.
How about now?
And then that composite of that truck was then used later on in a press release.
Investigators enlist the help of the FBI to hunt for physical evidence.
Based on Mr. Chronister's cooperation, he agreed to meet Detective Kamoski with members of the FBI evidence recovery team. They all went back to that location at East 18th and Allen Park.
The evidence recovery team was able to recover wadding, along with 2 shotgun pellets from the area of Allendale Park. Those pellets were consistent with the same pellets that were recovered from the body of William Knoll.
And for investigative purposes, that was enough for us to know that the attempted murder of Mr. Chronister and the murder of Mr. Knoll were related.
The other 2 shootings that we were also investigating of Corey Romero and John Jacoby, we knew the MO correlated almost exactly. A person walking or driving a vehicle being shot at from a moving vehicle. That was a major mindset behind the task force at the time, that we had a serial shooter out there.
So at this point in the investigation, We were still looking at a lot of pickup trucks. It was determined that maybe the best course of action would be to contact General Motors directly.
So in December of 2015, we sent the video of the truck going through the intersection to a GMC headquarters in Detroit.
Yep, there.
The staff member there took a look at that video, and because of certain markings on the truck, the year span was now something like 1982 to 1989, and not 1973 to 1979.
We had been looking for so long for 70s, and we're so confident that we were looking in the right year range.
So that prompted a updated press release, and we had to go back and recheck everything using that new criteria.
Nobody went outside, not at nighttime. Nobody let their kids play in the front yard without being watched anymore. Like, you had to watch your back, and you had to watch each other's back, because you didn't know. And it was really scary. I was almost certain it was gonna be a very long time before they caught him.
We thought we might just have to accept that they won't find him, that this will just have to be part of our lives, which is a tough thing to have to come to terms with.
In April 2017, one of the investigators assigned to the task force received information from a third party that he knew, reported that they worked at a bank in Loveland and that an individual had called and threatened the bank because he believed that the bank had stolen some money from him.
Find it or you're all dead. Hear me? Dead.
Where that ties into our investigation is that when we released the composite sketch of the suspect vehicle years earlier, the bank employees had seen that.
And when these bank tellers were questioned further, they brought up the fact that, yes, the individual used to drive a beat-up orange Chevy truck, and it had a loud engine. We ran the license plate on the vehicle, and we got a hit. The license plate came back to Christopher Parker as the owner.
That is the first time that we get any information on a person by the name of Christopher Parker. We believe that he does have access to weapons, which would heighten the way that we would respond.
The Loveland Police Department SWAT team to set up a perimeter on the house. Mr. Parker, while he was in the house, reached out to his mother, and she got on the phone and spoke to the mental health providers.
The Loveland Police Department SWAT team subsequently arrest him on a mental health hold. And while he was being transported to the hospital, he asked to speak to the Loveland Police Department. So I was requested to go to speak with Mr. Parker. Obviously, we asked Mr. Parker if he could remember where he was the day and the evening of the shooting with Mr. Knoll. However, he talked about being on his bike all day, riding around for like 14 hours, which just seemed to be highly improbable. I didn't really think that we would get a lot of information from him because that was, 2 years earlier. Mr. Parker was a very difficult person to interview and keep on task. He was kind of talking in circles.
That particular interview did not turn out well. There was no information provided about the crime. And he asked for an attorney, and the interview was over.
Investigators secure a warrant to examine Christopher Parker's garage.
So, doing a search of the vehicle, we've located that Mr. Parker had purchased that vehicle on April 9th, 2015, several months before the Knoll homicide. The previous owner of the vehicle registered the vehicle as a red Chevrolet pickup truck.
And now the vehicle was painted white, but that it was such a low-quality paint job that you could still see the orange paint coming through the white paint.
So when we were able to look at Mr. Parker's truck and examine it closer, it was obvious that Mr. Parker's truck used to be red or orange. You could see the color underneath the white paint that was on it. You also could look at the application of the white paint on the truck, and it was apparent that it was rushed and not painted very well. I knew right away that was it. I could just tell that that was the truck. That was the first time I was really excited about the case and knew that we had something pretty big. Our team members, the searchers, come back and tell me they located a gallon of Rust-Oleum paint that was white. And then also located in the garage was 19 cans of used white spray paint. That also seemed to match with what we were seeing as far as his vehicle was concerned. Mr. Parker's truck was not manufactured as white. It was actually red, and it's now changed colors after the shooting occurred with Mr. Knoll. So that was something that we were very interested in. Based on what we located during the search warrant, the initial interview with Mr. Parker at the hospital, I was fairly confident that we were looking at our killer.
However, in these investigations, there's a big difference of believing and proving it in court beyond a reasonable doubt. And it was all very circumstantial at this time.
Excuse me, sir. You gotta see this.
All right.
One of the next steps in the investigation is to try to locate the social media postings from Mr. Parker, especially historical ones, trying to go back and see what he was posting at the time of the shootings. So directly after the composite drawing came out of the pickup truck, Mr. Parker posted a comment on his social media, something to the effect of everybody paint your pickup trucks white. I thought that was an important part of our case. Mr. Parker felt it necessary to paint his truck a different color right after the public got to see what the suspect truck looked like.
In February 2018, Christopher Parker's mother calls Loveland police again.
His mother says that she's alarmed for his safety, that she's afraid that he's going to hurt him or someone in the house.
Mr. Parker had actually left me a message on my desk phone. I called him back, and he told me that he wanted to come in and talk with me. When I interviewed Mr. Parker, he then talks about purchasing a shotgun from a local Walmart, but then had given it back the day he had purchased it. During the interview, Mr. Parker becomes very animated. He gets very agitated. At one point in time, he jumps up in the room as if he's going to punch me. So we decide at that time it's probably best to not interview him any further. He then was transported again to the local hospital for a mental health evaluation.
Following that interview, we sent another investigator to Walmart at Denver and Eisenhower.
Hello, sir. I need to look at your firearms purchases from 2015.
We looked at their 2015 purchases of firearms and found a record that he had indeed purchased a shotgun in January of 2015, and that in addition of purchasing this shotgun, he had signed a form declaring that he knew that there was a no return policy.
And that was a key piece of evidence for us because Mr. Parker talks about the fact that he didn't have the weapon, that he returned it, and we knew that not to be true.
I asked Investigator Gillum to go purchase an exact make, model that has all the specifications that this shotgun had. He did that. It turned out to be an 18-inch, 12-gauge shotgun that was designed to be used in close quarters, something that would very well fit inside a vehicle without the barrel going outside the window. And he conducted test fires on this shotgun using a 3-inch, 12-gauge shell. On the shells that he test fired, the striations were consistent and matched the striations on the shotgun wadding that was found at the crime scene next to Mr. Knoll's body. It was the missing piece that we needed. The district attorney was comfortable enough in issuing an arrest warrant for Mr. Parker. After obtaining the arrest warrant, we wanted to take him into custody when he was by himself.
Two years and 9 months after the shooting with Mr. Knoll, we arrest Mr. Parker without incident on a traffic stop. Once we arrest a suspect, we will monitor their jail calls. And what we're hoping for there is they say something to somebody that would be pertinent for the investigation. In this case, while Mr. Parker was in custody, he has a jail call with his biological father who lives in Florida.
I know, but they don't have one gun on me. They don't have anything.
His father confronts Christopher about the case, asks him if he's involved, and makes some comments about the fact that the police, have his truck, they have his gun, they have the shells.
I don't know how they have any evidence. They have none. They have no gun, no shells, no proof that I did it.
And Christopher makes a comment back to his father that we don't have the shells. That was a key statement for us, especially about the shells, because there was no information put out about the fact of whether or not we located shells or not at the scene.
Christopher Parker is brought from jail to the sheriff's office for questioning.
Well, my name is Bob Coleman. I'm with the sheriff's office. This is Todd. He works with me.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. And the reason you're here is because you're under arrest.
We weren't going to let him talk in circles like he had previously. We were going to confront him with what we knew. And so that's what we did.
I didn't murder anybody. The guy was live on film after the truck drove by. And what happened then, bud? The guy was looking on his phone, and I looked over. I said hi to him. He said hi, and he waved to me.
And then he talks about the fact that Mr. Knoll was holding his phone and that he was wearing earbuds. That information was never released to the public. Only the shooter would know that information.
Mr. Parker is booked on a charge of murder in the first degree.
Christopher Parker later accepts a deal to plead guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder for killing Billy Knoll.
Mr. Parker received a 39-year prison sentence. That's a substantial sentence for him to carry out.
Prosecutors charged Parker with no crime in relation to the shooting incident involving Donald Chronister.
When the district attorneys talked with Mr. Parker's attorneys, they just came to an agreement that they would stick with the second-degree murder charge, that they would drop the attempted first-degree murder charge, and both sides agreed to the terms.
Investigators clear Parker of any involvement in the shootings of Corey Romero and John Jacoby.
During all this work, we were not able to find any evidence whatsoever linking Mr. Parker to the shooting that occurred in April and linking him to the shooting that occurred in May. I'd say that although the shooting in April and May have not been solved yet, I feel that they will be someday.
Investigators can only speculate about what drove Christopher Parker to murder Billy Knoll.
It's my belief that he was copycatting the first two shootings, and that's the night he chose to do it, and that he left his residence with that shotgun that he had purchased from Walmart, and that he was determined to shoot and kill someone. Came across Mr. Knoll, and his actions of going westbound and then turning around and going eastbound tells me that he made the intentional decision to turn around and shoot at Mr. Knoll because he was a stationary, close target, and his chances of succeeding were much higher. The video sent us down the right path and basically led to the arrest and conviction of Mr. Parker.
When Christopher Parker killed my brother, he took away what could have been and created a great deal of chaos and pain, generations of pain, generations of trauma.
I will say I recently spoke to Mary, and she did inform me that she got a bunch of donations from Grandpa's college peers and everything, and they put together enough donations.
The rain that fell on the night of October 14th, 1988, didn't wash away the blood. It sealed it beneath an impenetrable layer of cold autumn mud that took 38 years to yield its secrets. Imagine walking into a house where the coffee is still warm in the pot, the television is humming with late-night static, a half-eaten dinner sits undisturbed on the dining table, and yet the family of 3 who lived there has completely vanished into thin air. No signs of forced entry, no struggle reported by the neighbors, no defensive wounds found on the pristine surfaces of a suburban dream turned living nightmare. It was the absolute epitome of a cold case mystery, a void in the chest of a small town that refused to heal, a dark ledger that mocked 3 generations of detectives who stared at the fading crime scene photographs until their own hair turned silver. For nearly 4 decades, the names of the victim family were whispered like a curse through the halls of the precinct, an unsolved anomaly that stood as a grim testament to the fact that sometimes the earth simply opens up and swallows the innocent without leaving so much as a fingerprint behind. And then the circuit broke. It wasn't a sudden confession or a deathbed repentance that cracked the seal. It was a routine maintenance excavation on an old municipal water line 3 miles outside the city perimeter that struck a buried industrial drum, a rusted steel canister designed to withstand the crushing weight of time itself. When the forensic lockbreakers finally pried open that corroded metal lid under the blinding glare of floodlights, they didn't just find physical remnants. They found the missing puzzle pieces of a 38-year-old horror story, a direct biological link that pointed straight toward a face that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The headline broke across the wires like a sudden clap of thunder. Suspect finally in cuffs, and with those 5 words, the long-buried trauma of 1988 was wrenched back into the cold daylight, forcing an aging community to realize that the phantom they had been running from for half a century was someone they had passed on the street every single day. The excavation site quickly transformed into a high-security forensic perimeter, a white canvas city erected over the mud to shield the investigation from a public that had suddenly remembered how to be terrified. The ground was meticulously sifted, every teaspoon of dirt analyzed by specialized anthropologists who moved with a slow, agonizing precision of people unearthing an ancient curse. Inside the drum, the preservation was chilling. The lack of oxygen had created a localized time capsule, keeping the synthetic fibers of a child's winter jacket as vibrant and blue as the day it was bought, juxtaposed against the grim, skeletal reality of what lay beneath it. The detectives from the cold case squad, young men and women who hadn't even been born when the first emergency call went out in October 1988, stood over the evidence bags with a look of absolute, unblinking intensity. They were looking at a signature, a highly specific method of binding and containment that required a level of mechanical skill and access that normal citizens simply didn't possess. It wasn't the work of a panicked drifter or an impulsive intruder. It was a logistics operation, planned with the cold, clinical precision of an engineer executing a blueprint. As the laboratory technicians began running the DNA extractions from the biological markers preserved within the steel matrix, the files at the central precinct were cracked open once again, the old leather binders groaning under the sudden, frantic handling. The original investigation from 1988 had been a masterclass in frustration, a sprawling, chaotic hunt that ran into brick walls at every single turn. The local police had checked thousands of leads, interviewed every known associate, dragged the local reservoirs, and checked out-of-state transit logs, but the trail had gone cold within 72 hours of the disappearance. The community had slowly unraveled under the weight of the unknown. Paranoia had become the default settings of the town, with parents refusing to let their children play in the front yards, and neighbors installing multiple deadbolts on doors that had previously never seen a key. The safe, predictable rhythm of suburban life had been permanently shattered by the realization that a predator of unmatched calculation was operating within their borders, a phantom who knew exactly how the authorities investigated, how the evidence was processed, and how to stay precisely one step ahead of the law. The breakthrough came from a single, overlooked detail in the old property registries that hadn't matched the primitive computerized systems of the late 80s. The industrial drum had been tracked back to a defunct chemical distribution plant that had closed down months before the crime occurred, a facility whose surplus inventory had been liquidated under a private contract signed by a local logistics supervisor. When the name on that contract was cross-referenced with the new DNA profiles emerging from the state lab, the air inside the war room turned absolutely ice-cold. The profile didn't match a career criminal or a known suspect from the fringes of society. It belonged to a highly respected member of the local infrastructure council, a man who had personally served on the oversight committee that reviewed the police budget during the height of the original investigation. He had been a phantom in plain sight, a wolf who had dressed himself in the armor of public service, utilizing his access to monitor the exact progress of the case, while offering his condolences to the surviving relatives. The logistics of the arrest had to be handled with the secrecy of a military strike, the task force fully aware that any leak would cause the suspect to deploy the same evasion tactics he had perfected over 38 years. At exactly 5:14 a.m., under the cover of a dense, freezing fog that rolled off the river, 3 unmarked tactical units closed the perimeter around a pristine, colonial-style home in the town's most affluent historic district. There were no sirens, no shouted commands through megaphones, just the hard, metallic crack of a hydraulic ram fracturing the heavy oak front door. When the suspect was led out into the driveway minutes later, his wrists bound in heavy steel, his eyes squinting against the sudden glare of flashing blue lights, he didn't scream, he didn't protest his innocence, and he didn't look at the small crowd of early morning onlookers who had gathered at the edge of the yellow tape. He simply adjusted his jaw, his face an impenetrable mask of stone, as if he had been expecting this exact knock on his door for nearly 40 years and had already rehearsed his silence down to the very last breath. The shockwave of the arrest tore through the town center like a physical blow, dismantling the fragile, carefully constructed peace that had taken decades to establish. People who had gone to school with the suspect's children, who had sat across from him at civic dinners, and who had voted for his infrastructure projects found themselves staring at the evening news broadcasts with a profound, nauseating sense of betrayal. The realization that their safety had been a managed lie, that the man who had helped secure the funding for the local parks was the very same entity who had converted those spaces into a hunting ground, broke the psychological fabric of the community. The town library, the local diner, the historic archives, every single space where his name had been etched into plaques or recorded in minutes was suddenly viewed as a crime scene by extension, a parallel world where the beast had been allowed to groom its reputation, while the bones of his victims turned to dust in a buried steel barrel. Inside the secure interrogation wing of the county facility, the atmosphere was a study in absolute psychological warfare. The suspect sat with his hands folded flat on the metal table, his breathing slow, steady, and entirely rhythmic, completely unbothered by the heavy presence of the state prosecutors who lined the other side of the room. The detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece, spreading the high-resolution digital scans of the chemical contracts, the DNA match criteria, and the structural analysis of the industrial drum across the surface like cards in a high-stakes game where the house had finally fixed the deck. They didn't use anger or theatrical threats. They spoke in the flat, clinical tones of accountants delivering an audit of a long-overdue debt. They showed him the timeline, the precise hours on October 14th, 1988, when his personal vehicle had been logged near the municipal utility lines, matching the exact composition of the soil caked inside the wheel wells of his old, preserved truck. The suspect didn't break. He adjusted his glasses with a slow, deliberate movement that suggested a man who still believed he controlled the narrative of the valley. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, dry rasp that carried the arrogance of 4 decades of successful evasion. "You have found a box of old rust," he whispered, his eyes locked onto the lead detective with a cold, predatory focus. "You have strings of numbers from a laboratory that didn't exist when the world you are investigating was alive. You think you have cracked a cold case, but all you have done is open a grave that the town had already agreed to forget. The people don't want your truth. They want the silence that allowed them to sleep for 38 years. You are not bringing justice to this valley. You are bringing the storm." The words hung in the sterile air of the room, a chilling confirmation that the monster had never left Blackwood Creek. He had simply waited for the ice to melt. The arrogance that hung in the interrogation room didn't just challenge the detectives. It anchored the reality of a multi-decade deception that was currently paralyzing the streets outside. While the suspect, Leonard Vance, sat behind reinforced glass, his physical empire, a sprawling network of warehouse facilities, logistics firms, and private land holdings across the county, was systematically surrounded by state and federal authorities. The warrant wasn't a standard document. It was an institutional mandate that authorized the complete forensic seizure of Vance Logistics, a company that had handled the municipal transport contracts for the entire valley since 1982. The investigators knew that the steel drum found by the water line wasn't an isolated incident of disposal. It was the logistical output of a highly organized, professional infrastructure designed to move weight, navigate checkpoints, and bury secrets with absolute geometric precision. Outside the main office of Vance Logistics on the industrial fringe of the town, the morning traffic had been entirely halted by state police barricades. White forensic trailers backed up to the loading docks, their climate control units buzzing against the damp, heavy air. Teams of technicians in high-visibility vests began offloading crates of specialized equipment, ground-penetrating radar arrays, deep-bore soil samplers, and digital imaging devices designed to see through reinforced concrete. The employees, arriving for their shifts in the early morning fog, were turned back at the gates by armed troopers, their faces expressions of stunned, silent disbelief as they watched the company logo being covered by blue plastic tarps. The realization was beginning to harden. The company that had delivered the structural components for the town's growth was being audited as a front for an industrial-scale graveyard. Inside the primary warehouse, a structure that covered 3 acres of reinforced steel and corrugated iron, the lead forensic investigator mapped out a grid pattern that would take weeks to execute. The air inside smelled of diesel exhaust, industrial rust inhibitor, and old wooden pallets, the exact olfactory profile caked into the seals of the recovered 1988 canister. The radar operators began rolling their units across the smooth, polished concrete floor of Sector 4, a section of the facility that had been added to the complex in the winter of 1989, just months after the disappearance of the Miller family. The screens immediately began to display structural anomalies beneath the 6-inch slab, points where the rebar reinforcement had been cut away and replaced with dense, non-porous material that defied the surrounding geological signatures. The digital reconstruction of Leonard Vance's daily operational logs from October 1988 was happening simultaneously in the Tech Command vehicle parked in the courtyard. Analysts using data recovery software were extracting entries from a legacy mainframe system that had been preserved in the company's climate-controlled archive. The files were a terrifying testament to a dual existence. On October 14, 1988, the exact night the sirens had remained silent while a family vanished, Vance's digital signature had logged 3 separate weight verification certificates at the automated truck scales on Route 9. The cargo had been listed as industrial waste slurry, a classification that bypassed standard environmental manifests under a municipal waiver that Vance himself had helped draft during his tenure on the Regional Infrastructure Council. He had used the legal framework of the town's environmental cleanup programs to transport his horrors in plain sight, utilizing the company's own fleet of heavy flatbeds to move the canisters under the cover of routine utility maintenance. As the physical evidence inside the warehouse began to align with the data grid, the task force dispatched a secondary unit to Vance's private hunting lodge, an isolated structure sitting on 80 acres of densely forested terrain near the northern ridge of the valley. The property had been in the Vance family for generations, a place where local politicians, judges, and business leaders had gathered for private retreats during the autumn hunting seasons. It was a space that had always been viewed as an extension of the town's elite social circle, a sanctuary of privacy and privilege that was completely insulated from the scrutiny of the local sheriff's department. When the tactical team breached the heavy timber gates of the Ridge property, they found a facility that was designed for total operational autonomy. The lodge wasn't just a rustic cabin. It was supported by a subterranean utility complex that included an industrial-grade machine shop, a chemical storage vault, and a private generator station. The air inside the workshop was static, thick with the scent of machining oil and fine metal shavings. On the heavy steel workbenches sat the specialized tools required to thread and seal industrial canisters, pneumatic crimpers, heavy-duty pipe threaders, and custom-fabricated metal seals that bore the exact toolmark signatures discovered on the lid of the 1988 drum. Leonard Vance hadn't just used surplus industrial equipment. He had customized the containment systems himself, treating the preservation of his crimes as a specialized engineering challenge. The lead detective moved through the subterranean machine shop with a slow, heavy stride, his boots clicking against the concrete floor. He stopped in front of a row of steel filing cabinets that were secured with high-security padlocks. When the lockbreakers cleared the mechanisms, the drawers slid open to reveal an absolute, alphabetical directory of land surveys, construction manifests, and soil core samples stretching back to 1978. Vance had kept a geological record of every infrastructure project his company had ever touched. He had mapped the natural drainage systems of the valley, the variations in water table depth, and the chemical composition of the soil layers beneath every major highway expansion in the state. He wasn't looking for building sites. He was cataloging the stability of potential burial zones, ensuring that the ground chosen to hold his secrets would never shift, sink, or betray the configuration of the concrete caps he poured over them. Back in the historic district of the town, the social unraveling was accelerating with a violent, unpredictable velocity. The local bank, where Vance had served as a member of the board of directors for 25 years, was hit by a sudden, frantic wave of commercial withdrawals as local businesses attempted to sever their financial links to his corporate entities. The town square, usually vibrant with the activity of an early summer weekend, felt like an open-air funeral. People gathered in small, hushed clusters near the historic fountain, their eyes fixed on their mobile devices as local news outlets began broadcasting leaks from the warehouse excavation. Every infrastructure project Vance had sponsored, the community center addition, the high school athletic complex, the pedestrian bridges over the creek, was now viewed as a potential structural deception, a series of monuments built by a monster to secure the blind trust of the population he was systematically preying upon. Inside the county jail's maximum security interrogation wing, the state prosecutors brought in their first technical reinforcement, Dr. Ellen Croft, a forensic taphonomist who had spent 2 decades analyzing the decomposition rates within sealed synthetic environments for the federal government. She sat across from Vance, her expression a clinical void, as she laid out a series of high-resolution macro photographs showing the internal crystallization patterns of the steel lining from the recovered drum. The container was injected with a specific compound of nitrogen gas prior to the final seal being crimped, Mr. Vance, Dr. Croft said, her voice steady and precise, cutting through the low hum of the room's air filtration unit. It's a technique used in long-term industrial storage to prevent oxygenation and biological decay. It requires a pressurized manifold system and a specific calculation of volume based on the mass of the contents. The crystallization we are looking at under the microscope shows that this wasn't an amateur experiment. The manifold used to inject that gas had a structural defect, a slight scoring on the valve threading that occurs only when a custom machine nozzle is used. We found that exact nozzle on the compressor unit in your Ridge workshop 3 hours ago. The match is molecular, Mr. Vance. Your machinery didn't just touch that container, it authored the atmosphere inside it. Vance's left hand, still resting flat on the table, tightened slightly, his knuckles turning a hard, porcelain white against the gray metal surface. He looked at the photographs, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the crystalline structures with the critical eye of a veteran manufacturer. For the first time since his arrest, the absolute mask of his composure showed a hairline fracture. He wasn't undone by emotion. He was unsettled by the forensic reconstruction of his technical process. He had spent 38 years believing that his engineering was superior to the natural laws of decay, that his calculation had outsmarted the environment, and now the state was showing him that his own tools had left a permanent, digital signature in the rust. He leaned back in his chair, his breathing shifting to a slightly faster, shallower rhythm. When he spoke, the defensive arrogance had been replaced by a low, vibrating coldness that felt like an ideological declaration. "You think you are dismantling a criminal, Doctor," Vance whispered, his voice holding the hard resonance of a man who spent his life directing hundreds of men. "But you are looking at a system. A town doesn't grow because people are good. It grows because the infrastructure is solid. I built the roads that brought the commerce into this valley. I built the distribution networks that kept your stores filled and your families employed. The price of that progress is a management of resources that your courts are too small to understand. The individuals you are looking for, the Millers, were friction in the gears of that progress. They were a disruption to the stability of the development contract. I adjusted the mechanism. I took the noise out of the system so that the town could build its future on a smooth, uninterrupted foundation. The prosecutors in the observation room sat in a state of stunned, motionless horror. The confession wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a clinical justification that stripped human lives of their humanity, converting a triple homicide into a routine administrative correction. Vance didn't see himself as a murderer hiding in the dark. He saw himself as a structural engineer who had cleared a site of debris. He had weaponized his corporate authority and his civic influence to transform the valley into a managed machine, where any individual who threatened the predictable, profitable trajectory of his enterprises was systematically processed and integrated into the physical topography of the county. The legal counteroffensive from Vance's defense team began to deploy with rapid, desperate energy within the hour. They filed a massive, 200-page injunction with the state Supreme Court, demanding an immediate halt to the warehouse excavation and the absolute suppression of all forensic data derived from the Ridge property. They argued that the task force was utilizing speculative forensic methodologies and that the search warrants had been issued based on circumstantial data that violated the statutory limitations of a 38-year-old case. They sought to disqualify Dr. Croft's analysis, claiming that the crystallization theory was an unproven scientific paradigm designed to create prejudice in the minds of a potential jury. But the state attorney general was already moving to block the maneuver. Working from the Capitol, she filed a counterbrief that invoked the state's Emergency Public Safety Preservation Acts, arguing that Vance's logistical network represented an ongoing, structural hazard to the environment and the civil security of the region. By framing the logistics firm as an active, unmitigated hazard, the state could bypass the traditional limitations of standard criminal procedure, keeping the forensic teams on site at the warehouse and the Ridge property under an unbroken, state-sanctioned mandate. The legal battle was no longer a chess match over old files. It had become a total war over the control of the physical ground of the county. As the second night of the investigation descended upon the valley, the physical manifestation of the state's power remained a dominant, terrifying feature of the landscape. The floodlights at Sector 4 of the warehouse burned through the dense, industrial fog, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet asphalt of the loading docks. The sound of heavy-duty concrete saws began to echo through the valley, a sharp, high-pitched scream that cut through the silence of the night as the forensic teams began the slow, physical breach of the reinforced slab. Each cut of the diamond-tipped blades was a literal tearing away of the pavement that had covered the truth since 1989, a slow, mechanical exhumation that was drawing closer with every passing minute to the final, hidden chapters of Leonard Vance's Empire of Ice. Inside his quiet study 3 states away, Detective Miller sat under the pale light of a single desk lamp, his fingers tracing the digital coordinates of the warehouse grid that had been transmitted to him by the task force. He had spent his entire career looking for a monster that fit the standard profiles, a broken, chaotic individual operating from the margins of society. He had never contemplated that the beast could be the very man who signed the authorization forms for the department's fleet vehicles, the man who sat next to the governor at the dedication of the regional water treatment plant. He looked at a photograph from 1988 showing Vance standing at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, his smile warm, his suit immaculate, his hands holding the large silver scissors. Miller felt a cold, crushing weight in his chest as he realized that the scissors weren't just a prop. They were a symbol of a man who had spent his entire life cutting the threads of human lives with the absolute, unbiased authority of a civic king. The state's cyberforensics unit completed their secondary extraction of the mainframe files at midnight, delivering a devastating confirmation of Vance's target selection methodology. They found that he had systematically utilized the company's transport routing software to monitor the movements of specific delivery drivers, contractors, and low-income families who utilized the peripheral roads near his warehouse facilities. He had turned the telemetry data of his own truck fleet into a localized surveillance network, tracking the times when these individuals were most isolated, when their vehicles were vulnerable to mechanical staging, and when the local response times were at their absolute lowest. He had engineered the abductions with the same efficiency that he used to optimize his shipping routes, treating the extraction of human beings as a problem of transit management. The legal machinery of the state was now moving with a momentum that could not be checked by injunctions or technical motions. The grand jury was called into an extraordinary midnight session at the Capitol, the prosecutors delivering the physical links, the custom nozzle specifications, the weight certificates, and the cryptographic log signatures, directly to the panel under a tight, high-security protocol. The indictment that was emerging was a document of unprecedented scope, a literal blueprint of an institutional conspiracy that had successfully hijacked the legal and physical infrastructure of a county for nearly 40 years. The cold case was no longer a historical file sitting in a dusty drawer. It had become an active, breathing engine of state retribution, an absolute machine that was preparing to crush the fortress that Leonard Vance had spent his entire life constructing in the dark. The high-pitched scream of the diamond-tipped concrete saws didn't just rip through the midnight air of Sector 4. It sliced through the collective memory of the entire valley, tearing away the physical barriers that had kept Leonard Vance's darkest calculations buried under 6 inches of polished industrial cement since the winter of 1989. The white forensic tent cowering inside the cavernous warehouse became a theater of cold, hard reality as the ground-penetrating radar arrays were rolled back, replaced by hydraulic lifts, structural jacks, and heavy-duty demolition teams operating under the absolute authority of a federal evidence warrant. The air grew thick with a fine, chalky white dust, a synthetic frost that settled over the shoulders of the technicians like a reminder of the decades that had passed in total, enforced silence. By 2 a.m., the forensic teams had successfully isolated and removed a 4-by-8-foot section of the reinforced concrete floor, exposing a secondary barrier beneath the foundation, a sheet of heavy-duty, industrial-grade polyethylene insulation that bore the distinct, molded logo of an infrastructure supply company that Vance Logistics had acquired in a hostile corporate takeover during the late 80s. Beneath that synthetic shroud lay the true, undisturbed geology of the crime scene, a deep layer of localized river silt, treated with the identical chemical lime compounds discovered inside the recovered 1988 canister. The scent that rose from the breach was not the smell of fresh earth or natural decay. It was a clinical, chemical cocktail of ammonia, ozone, and old iron, the unmistakable olfactory signature of an intentional preservation matrix. The recovery process moved with an agonizing, millimetric deliberation that tested the endurance of the state crime lab personnel. Moving in pairs, utilization of fine plastic scoops and dental brushes revealed the outline of a second container, not a vertical drum this time, but a massive, custom-fabricated steel shipping crate, its seams reinforced with heavy-duty structural welds that had been coated in a black, rubberized marine sealant. The dimensions of the crate matched the exact space allocations listed in Vance's private workshop ledger under the heading Project Matrix, Sector 4. It was a piece of custom cargo, designed to be integrated into the foundation of the building, a literal load-bearing pillar of the town's most successful logistics enterprise. As the heavy-duty winches began the slow, rhythmic strain of lifting the steel vault from its silt-caked tomb, the digital command unit in the courtyard was processing a massive influx of data recovered from the legacy mainframe system. The cyberforensics team had broken through the secondary encryption layers of Vance's private administrative accounts, exposing a digital filing directory titled Systemic Reductions, 1985 to 1995. Inside those files lay the cold, mathematical verification of a decade-long campaign of human extraction that had operated under the guise of commercial optimization. The files contained detailed telemetry profiles of the Miller family, the father, David, the mother, Ellen, and their 7-year-old daughter, Katie, whose sudden, absolute disappearance in November 1989 had been written off by the county sheriff as a desperate flight from financial ruin. The local narrative at the time, heavily pushed by editorials in the local paper that Vance's family foundation subsidized, was that David Miller had embezzled funds from a small automotive repair shop and fled across the border with his family in the middle of the night. The digital logs shattered that comforting myth with a brutal, undeniable finality. They showed that Vance Logistics vehicles had been dispatched to the perimeter of the Miller residence 3 times in the 48 hours leading up to their disappearance, their routing schedules altered by Vance himself to create a localized transit blind spot. The log entries were written with the flat, emotionless vocabulary of an inventory manager tracking the movement of surplus pallets. One entry, dated November 12, 1989, at 11:42 p.m., read simply, Site 4 cleared of structural debris. Unit volume integrated into Sector 4 alignment. Manifest locked. There were no names, no references to violence, no admissions of remorse, just the clinical verification that 3 human beings had been processed, categorized, and converted into foundational material for a warehouse expansion that would ensure the company's dominance in the regional distribution market. The news of the discovery and the subsequent identification of the Miller family manifest leaked through the media filters at dawn, turning the public despair in the valley into a state of absolute, volatile paralysis. The local high school, where a massive portrait of Leonard Vance hung in the main auditorium to honor his multi-million-dollar donation to the athletic complex, became the target of a spontaneous, furious gathering. Students and parents watched in silence as the school principal, his hands shaking with visible emotion, personally climbed a ladder and tore the portrait from the wall, fracturing the heavy gilded frame on the linoleum floor. The sense of violation had moved past individual grief. It had become an institutional poison, leaving the town's population to wonder if the very ground beneath their feet was a platform built by a monster to secure their unquestioning trust. Inside the interrogation wing of the Capitol facility, the atmosphere had reached a critical mass of psychological confrontation. The state prosecutors did not bring in more files. They brought in a physical object, a faded, plastic-wrapped child's toy, a small yellow model truck that had been recovered from the glove compartment of Vance's preserved 1988 fleet vehicle during the raid on his hunting lodge. The toy had been identified through old family photographs as belonging to 7-year-old Katie Miller, an item she had been carrying with her on the afternoon she vanished from her front yard. The lead prosecutor pushed the plastic bag across the metal table, allowing it to rest directly in front of Vance's folded hands. "We opened the sector for Vault 3 hours ago, Leonard," the prosecutor said, his voice dropping to a hard, level tone that echoed off the sterile walls. "The pathology team is down there right now, with the dental records from '89. We don't need your confession to secure a capital conviction. The DNA match on the marine sealant is already absolute. What we want to know is how many more construction projects your foundation funded between '95 and today. We want to know if the pedestrian bridge over Route 9 is a monument or a grave." Vance did not look down at the toy. His eyes remained fixed on the prosecutor with a flat, predatory focus that suggested a man who still believed his structural contributions to the county exempted him from the moral laws of ordinary men. He adjusted his glasses with a slow, deliberate movement, his posture remaining as rigid and imperial as if he were still presiding over a board of directors meeting. "You speak of individual names as if they exist in a vacuum, Counselor," Vance whispered, his voice dry, sharp, and entirely steady. "A town is not an aggregate of personal feelings. It is an economic engine that requires continuous, uninterrupted calibration to survive. In 1989, this valley was on the verge of bankruptcy. The manufacturing plants were closing, the tax base was evaporating, and the state was preparing to bypass our transit corridor entirely in favor of the Northern Highway. I secured the logistics monopoly that brought the multinationals into this valley. I built the infrastructure that kept your schools open and your banks solvent. The families you are looking for were a friction point, individuals who refused to sell their land parcels, who tied up critical development zones in frivolous litigation, who threatened the predictability of the growth model. I managed the friction. I integrated the liabilities into the assets so that the community could build its future on a smooth, profitable foundation." The sheer, detached clinical nature of his justification sent a physical chill through the observation booth. The detectives and state profilers realized that they weren't dealing with a standard sociopathic impulse or a hidden compulsion. They were dealing with an extreme, institutionalized delusion that had been nurtured over 4 decades of unchecked corporate power. Vance had weaponized the tools of civil administration and corporate planning to such a degree that he viewed the systematic elimination of human beings as a legitimate form of municipal eminent domain, routine engineering correction designed to optimize the performance of his empire. The legal counteroffensive from Vance's corporate defense network deployed with a frantic, desperate velocity as the morning progressed. Realizing that the physical evidence from Sector 4 had rendered their technical arguments about DNA degradation obsolete, they filed a radical motion with the Federal Court of Appeals, demanding the immediate recusal of the state attorney general and the total transfer of the case to a federal jurisdiction outside the state. They argued that the systematic leaking of legacy mainframe logs and forensic pathological data had created a media lynching environment that made an impartial jury selection an absolute impossibility within the entire region. But the momentum of the state's prosecution was now backed by a tidal wave of public and political fury that could not be checked by procedural maneuvers. The state Supreme Court issued a summary denial of the defense's injunction within 2 hours, stating that the unique, structural nature of the crimes demanded that the adjudication occur within the specific jurisdiction that had been subverted. The governor signed a declaration of extraordinary legal emergency, stripping Vance's surviving corporate entities of their protective shields and placing the entirety of Vance Logistics under a permanent state receivership. The company's financial accounts, worth tens of millions of dollars, were frozen and diverted to a state-managed trust fund designed to finance the complete structural audit of every square inch of commercial concrete poured in the county since 1982. As the afternoon sun cast long, pale shadows across the industrial park, the physical scale of that audit began to manifest along the valley's main transit routes. White State Department of Transportation trucks, equipped with specialized subterranean imaging arrays, began moving in slow, synchronized convoys along the perimeter of Route 9, their sensors scanning the soil layers beneath the asphalt for the distinct crystalline and chemical anomalies that signaled a hidden containment structure. The county was no longer a safe collection of suburban neighborhoods. It had been transformed into an active, sprawling crime scene, a geological puzzle where every bridge support, every highway ramp, and every commercial foundation was viewed through a lens of profound, terrifying suspicion. Inside his quiet study 3 states away, Detective Miller sat in front of his monitors, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the digital mapping files. He had spent his decades of retirement believing that the Vance case was a historical failure, a puzzle that had gone cold because of his own limitations as an investigator. Now, as he watched the live updates from the Sector 4 excavation, he felt a crushing, hollow weight in his chest. He looked at his own handwritten field notes from November 1989, remembering the weeks he had spent searching the local forests for Ellen Miller's car, completely blind to the fact that the vehicle had been processed through Vance's commercial scrap matrix while the family's remains were being sealed into the foundation of the very warehouse he drove past every single morning on his way to the office. The realization of how easily a community can be blinded by the illusions of progress was the true, lingering horror of the case. Vance hadn't succeeded because he was an invisible phantom. He had succeeded because he was too big to see. He had covered his atrocities with the very roads the citizens drove on, the schools their children attended, and the economic stability they relied upon to sleep at night. He had converted the entire population into unwitting consumers of his crimes, transforming the valley into an active participant in its own victimization. The state's cyberforensics unit completed their analysis of the mainframe's secondary communications directory at midnight, uncovering a series of encrypted emails from the early 2000s that indicated Vance had been utilizing his seat on the regional utility board to monitor the development of new forensic technologies. He had systematically altered the town's environmental monitoring contracts to ensure that soil and groundwater testing near his facilities was handled by a private lab that is foundation-controlled, effectively blocking any chemical signature of his containment systems from reaching the state databases. He had built a fortress of data security that was as thick and non-porous as the concrete slabs he poured over his victims. As the third night of the investigation descended upon Blackwood Creek, the high-pitched hum of the subterranean sensors along Route 9 continued without interruption, a mechanical pulse that seemed to mirror the anxious, hypervigilant breathing of the population. The town was standing on the precipice of a total institutional collapse, its government dissolved, its economy frozen, and its collective history exposed as an engineered deception. The cold case from 1988 had been cracked, the suspect was finally in cuffs, but the exhumation of the valley was a process that was just beginning, a long, agonizing march toward a truth that would either cleanse the ground or leave the town a permanent monument to a monster's empire of ice. The digital telemetry data didn't merely provide a map of Leonard Vance's movements. It acted as a forensic scalpel that began dissecting the institutional infrastructure of the entire county. By the time the clock struck 4 a.m. on the fourth day of the continuous operation, the state capital had shifted from administrative shock into a state of active legal warfare. The grand jury, convened in a high-security chamber beneath the state Supreme Court, was presented with a document that would permanently alter the legal landscape of the region, a multi-count indictment under the State Enterprise Corruption Act, framing Vance Logistics not as a commercial entity that had shielded a criminal, but as a structural weapon designed to execute and conceal a 38-year campaign of systematic elimination. The white forensic city surrounding Sector 4 of the warehouse had expanded to engulf the adjacent shipping yards. The sound of heavy diesel engines had been replaced by the steady, low-frequency hum of industrial air scrubbers, deployed to manage the chemical particulates rising from the deep excavation trench. Technicians using specialized diamond wire saws had succeeded in extracting the custom steel shipping crate from the river silt beneath the foundation, hoisting it into a mobile containment laboratory with a mechanical precision that felt less like traditional police work and more like a hazardous materials recovery operation. Inside the lab, under the blinding glare of high-intensity surgical lights, the extraction of the biological profiles was handled with an unyielding, clinical focus. The results were digitized and transmitted directly to the Central Command Unit, matching the legacy missing persons profiles from 1989 with a certainty that left no room for legal interpretation. As the physical markers from the Sector 4 vault aligned with the state database, the task force launched a simultaneous tactical assault on the County Land Registry Office. Investigators backed by state troopers entered the historic building at dawn, securing the analog archives and the digital servers that managed the property records for the entire valley stretching back to 1970. The analysis of these files, handled by a team of forensic title auditors, exposed the true mechanism of Vance's target selection. He hadn't chosen his victims based on personal malice or chaotic impulses. He had identified them through a systematic monitoring of the county's eminent domain projections and infrastructure development maps. The audit revealed that every single individual who had vanished within the valley border since 1982 had owned or occupied a parcel of land that sat directly within the path of a projected transit corridor, an industrial expansion zone, or a municipal utility easement managed by Vance's corporate network. If a property owner refused to accept a lowball corporate buyout, or if an independent contractor held a competing claim that threatened to delay a multi-million-dollar state development grant, their file was quietly transferred to Vance's private administrative ledger. Within weeks, their daily routines would be mapped, their vehicle telemetry tracked, and their names systematically converted into historical anomalies, unsolved missing persons cases that the local sheriff's department, under the political influence of Vance's Infrastructure Council, would casually file away as runaways or voluntary relocations. The publication of these specific details, leaked through an anonymous data stream within the Justice Department, turned the public despair in Blackwood Creek into a cold, vibrating fury. The town hall, an elegant brick structure that had been funded in part by a grant from Vance's Family Foundation, became the target of a silent, massive demonstration. Hundreds of residents stood in the freezing winter fog, their arms crossed, their eyes fixed on the empty windows of the executive offices. They weren't protesting a simple crime. They were witnessing the total exposure of their local history as an engineered deception. The realization that their civic growth, the high school additions, the industrial parks, the highway networks that brought commerce into the valley, had been paid for with a systematic erasure of their neighbors shattered the last vestiges of communal trust. Inside the interrogation wing of the Capitol facility, the psychological configuration between the prosecutors and the suspect had shifted into a clinical audit of an empire. Leonard Vance sat with his hands cuffed to the steel anchors of the table, his posture remaining perfectly rigid, his expression an impenetrable mask of aristocratic defiance. He did not look at the forensic pathograms showing the crystalline structures of the marine sealant, nor did he look at the digital files tracking the movement of his fleet vehicles on the night of the Miller disappearance. He looked only at the lead prosecutor, his eyes holding the hard, cold focus of a grandmaster who believed the game was merely transitioning into a more complex phase. "You are operating under the provincial illusion that a community can be built without a structural cost, counselor," Vance whispered, his voice dry, sharp, and entirely devoid of tremor. "A valley does not transition from a dying agricultural basin into a modern logistics hub through the application of moral sentiment. It requires the ruthless optimization of space, resources, and geography. The individuals you are weeping for were structural impediments, friction in the gears of the regional development contract. If I had allowed their individual obstinacy to dictate the trajectory of our infrastructure, this town would have been bypassed by the Interstate 3 decades ago. It would be a ghost town today, its citizens bankrupt, its schools closed, its future erased by economic irrelevance. I didn't destroy this valley. I engineered its survival. The concrete you are drilling up today is the very platform upon which your current society stands." The sheer, detached clinical arrogance of his defense was more disturbing to the state profilers than any sudden outburst of violence could have been. Vance had so thoroughly integrated his predatory impulses into the framework of corporate capitalism and municipal utility planning that he truly viewed the systematic execution of human beings as a legitimate form of administrative eminent domain, routine site clearing operation necessary to secure the profitable trajectory of his enterprises. He didn't see himself as a murderer hiding in the dark. He saw himself as a structural architect who had cleared the ground so that the town could build its future on a smooth, uninterrupted foundation. The legal counteroffensive from Vance's surviving corporate network deployed with an aggressive, desperate intensity as the afternoon progressed. Realizing that the forensic links from Sector 4 had rendered their arguments about DNA contamination entirely irrelevant, his defense team filed a radical, 500-page motion with the federal district court, demanding an immediate halt to all state-level exhumations and the total suppression of the legacy mainframe logs. They argued that the task force was utilizing unconstitutional methods of data extraction and that the implementation of state emergency public safety acts was a political maneuver designed to deny the defendant his right to a fair trial within an impartial venue. But the momentum of the prosecution was now backed by an absolute, non-negotiable public mandate that could not be checked by procedural delays. The federal judge, reviewing the brief from her chambers in the Capitol, issued a summary denial of the defense's injunction within 3 hours. In a blistering 10-page opinion that was immediately entered into the public record, she stated that the unique, institutional nature of the alleged crimes demanded that the adjudication occur within the exact jurisdiction that had been subverted. "The defendant is not charged with a series of isolated homicides," the judge wrote. "He is charged with the systematic weaponization of a municipality's infrastructure to facilitate human erasure. The restoration of the law cannot occur in a distant courtroom. The truth must be spoken in the very valley where the silence was enforced by concrete." As the evening light faded behind the northern ridge, the physical scale of the state's audit expanded into the historic center of Blackwood Creek itself. White Department of Transportation utility trucks, equipped with high-intensity ground-penetrating radar arrays, began rolling in slow, synchronized convoys along Main Street, their sensors scanning the soil layers beneath the historic brick sidewalks for the distinct chemical and structural signatures that signaled a hidden containment structure. The public library, the civic center, the pedestrian bridges over the creek, every single structure that had been funded or constructed by Vance's family foundation was now treated as an active crime scene, a geological puzzle where the ground was viewed through a lens of profound, terrifying suspicion. Inside his secluded residence 3 states away, Detective Miller sat in front of his monitors, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glare of the mapping data that continued to stream from the task force. He had spent his decades of retirement believing that the 1988 case was a historical failure, a mystery that had gone cold because of his own limitations as an investigator. Now, as he watched the live telemetry from the Main Street audit, he felt a crushing, hollow weight in his chest. He looked at his own handwritten field notes from October 1988, remembering the weeks he had spent checking out-of-state transit logs and dragging the local reservoirs, completely blind to the fact that the phantom he was hunting was the very man who sat next to the governor at the dedication of the new Civic Plaza. A plaza whose reinforced concrete foundation had been poured under the personal supervision of Leonard Vance just 48 hours after the Miller family had vanished into the autumn fog. The realization of how easily a community can be blinded by the illusions of progress was the true, lingering horror of the case. Vance hadn't succeeded because he operated in the shadows. He had succeeded because he was too big to see. He had covered his atrocities with the very roads the citizens drove on, the schools their children attended, and the economic stability they relied upon to sleep at night. He had converted the entire population into unwitting consumers of his crimes, transforming the valley into an active participant in its own victimization. The state's cyberforensics unit completed their secondary extraction of the mainframe's communication records at midnight, uncovering a series of encrypted files from the early 2000s that demonstrated Vance had been utilizing his seat on the Regional Utility Board to monitor the development of new forensic technologies. He had systematically altered the town's environmental monitoring contracts to ensure that soil and groundwater testing near his facilities was handled by a private laboratory that is foundation-controlled, effectively blocking any chemical signature of his containment systems from reaching the state databases. He had built a fortress of data security that was as thick and non-porous as the concrete slabs he poured over his victims. As the fifth night of the investigation descended upon Blackwood Creek, the high-pitched hum of the subterranean sensors along Route 9 continued without interruption, a mechanical pulse that seemed to mirror the anxious, hypervigilant breathing of the population. The town was standing on the precipice of a total institutional collapse, its government dissolved, its economy frozen, and its collective history exposed as an engineered deception. The cold case from 1988 had been cracked, the suspect was finally in cuffs, but the exhumation of the valley was a process that was just beginning, a long, agonizing march toward a truth that would either cleanse the ground or leave the town a permanent monument to a monster's empire of ice. The task force did not pause for the changing of the shifts. The investigation had become a continuous, unyielding engine that was currently grinding Vance's corporate legacy into dust. At 2 a.m., the ground-penetrating radar units operating in the basement of the old Civic Center detected a massive structural anomaly beneath the historical archive vault, a third reinforced containment zone that had been listed on the municipal blueprints as a foundational shear wall. The technical description was a lie that had survived for 35 years, a legal fiction that had allowed Vance's construction crews to inject tons of industrial-grade polymer grout directly into the subterranean bedrock without ever triggering a structural audit. The demolition teams moved in with heavy jackhammers, their headlamps cutting through the thick, stagnant air of the cellar as they began the slow, physical breach of the barrier. Each stroke of the pneumatic drills was a literal tearing away of the pavement that had covered the truth, a slow, mechanical exhumation that was drawing closer with every passing minute to the final, hidden chapters of Leonard Vance's empire. The air grew thick with a scent of lime and old copper, a visceral reminder that the ground can hold a secret for a lifetime, but that eventually, the earth always speaks, and when it does, it demands a reckoning that no amount of silence can ever turn away. Inside the Tech Command vehicle, the analysts were already processing the corporate emails associated with the Civic Center construction from the winter of 1991. They found that the project's funding had been accelerated by Vance's foundation immediately following a closed-door meeting of the Infrastructure Council, a meeting where a local property assessor had raised questions about the valuation of the land parcel selected for the industrial park expansion. The assessor's name had been removed from the county payroll less than 72 hours later, his sudden disappearance from the record categorized as an abrupt retirement to the West Coast. The matching file inside Vance's directory read simply, Assessor Matrix integrated into Civic Center alignment. Foundation locked. The link was unbroken. The methodology was absolute. Vance had used the very architecture of the town's governance to build the tombs of the people who challenged his authority, converting the physical symbols of their community into the permanent vaults of his victims. The county was no longer a safe collection of suburban neighborhoods. It had been transformed into a vast, geological puzzle where every bridge support, every highway ramp, and every commercial foundation was a monument to a monster's calculation. Inside his isolated study, Detective Miller looked at a photograph from 1991 showing the dedication of the Civic Center. Leonard Vance stood at the center of the frame, his smile warm, his hand holding the golden trowel as he laid the final symbolic brick of the foundation. Miller felt a cold, crushing weight in his chest as he realized that the trowel wasn't just a prop. It was the instrument of a man who had spent his entire life burying the innocent beneath the feet of the living, a wolf who had used the very progress of the valley to build his own private kingdom of the dark. The legal machinery of the state was now moving with a velocity that could not be checked by technical motions or corporate injunctions. The grand jury was called into an extraordinary morning session at the Capitol, the prosecutors delivering the physical links, the custom nozzle specifications, the weight certificates, and the cryptographic log signatures directly to the panel under a tight, high-security protocol. The indictment that was emerging was a document of unprecedented scope, a literal blueprint of an institutional conspiracy that had successfully hijacked the legal and physical infrastructure of a county for nearly 40 years. The cold case was no longer a historical file sitting in a dusty drawer. It had become an active, breathing engine of state retribution, an absolute machine that was preparing to crush the fortress that Leonard Vance had spent his entire life constructing in the dark. As the sun rose over the eastern ridge, casting a cold, amber light across the valley, the high-pitched hum of the subterranean sensors along Route 9 continued without interruption, a mechanical pulse that seemed to mirror the anxious, hypervigilant breathing of the population. The town was standing on the precipice of a total institutional collapse, its government dissolved, its economy frozen, and its collective history exposed as an engineered deception. The cold case from 1988 had been cracked, the suspect was finally in cuffs, but the exhumation of the valley was a process that was just beginning, a long, agonizing march toward a truth that would either cleanse the ground or leave the town a permanent monument to a monster's empire of ice. The next phase of the forensic excavation inside the Civic Center cellar was scheduled to breach the primary seal of the shear wall at noon. The task force had already brought in specialized drainage equipment and chemical containment arrays, fully aware that the atmosphere inside the vault would be an industrial hazard, a localized time capsule holding the molecular remnants of a 35-year-old horror story. The investigators moved with a grim, solemn determination, their faces hardening with every step they took into the damp gloom of the basement. They knew they were not just recovering bodies. They were executing an institutional audit of a monster's soul, a slow, mechanical process that would not stop until every square inch of Leonard Vance's empire had been brought into the cold, unforgiving light of the truth. The structural breach of the Civic Center's foundation wall at precisely 12:14 p.m. did not just release 35 years of trapped, chemically stagnant air into the damp basement. It shattered the final, legal illusion that Leonard Vance's defense network had spent decades constructing. The Industrial Containment Laboratory, rigged with negative pressure air filtration units to neutralize the high concentrations of volatile polymers and lime dust, buzzed with an aggressive, mechanical hum that reverberated through the hollowed-out stone building. As the diamond wire saws completed their final, vertical cut through the reinforced concrete shear wall, a massive 2-ton slab of polished industrial aggregate was pulled free by hydraulic winches, exposing the dark, clinical interior of Vance's third hidden vault. The scene cowering within that subterranean void was an absolute validation of the task force's digital reconstruction matrix. This was not a chaotic dump site. It was a highly organized, structural depository. The interior walls were lined with the same non-porous marine sealant discovered in Sector 4, the black rubberized coating caked in a fine white powder of chemical inhibitors that had prevented the natural movement of moisture or biological decomposition. At the center of the vault sat 2 pristine, custom-fabricated aluminum canisters, their dimensions matching the exact transport specifications listed in Vance's private mainframe directories under the heading Civic Integration, 1991. The forensic technicians, moving in synchronized pairs under the blinding white glare of specialized tactical lamps, began the slow, millimetric extraction of the containers, treating them with the clinical caution of personnel handling volatile military ordnances. While the physical recovery teams were documenting the structural layout of the vault, the financial title auditors at the Central Precinct had broken through the secondary firewall of Vance's family foundation, exposing a paper trail that linked the construction of the Civic Center directly to a series of fraudulent federal infrastructure grants. The files showed that in the winter of 1991, Vance had systematically altered the geological surveys for the downtown development zone, claiming that the bedrock beneath the archive vault required emergency polymer injection stabilization to prevent the collapse of the municipal sewage lines. He had used federal tax dollars to fund the engineering of his own private tombs, utilizing the public works budget to purchase the specialized industrial machinery, the custom nozzles, and the non-porous chemical sealants required to keep his victims permanently hidden beneath the feet of the living. The identification of the remains cowering within the primary aluminum canister was completed by the State Pathology Unit at 3:30 p.m., matching the dental records and biological markers of Thomas Albright, the county property assessor who had mysteriously vanished from the records in December 1991 after raising critical questions about the valuation of Vance's industrial park land parcels. The digital manifest inside Vance's directory, decrypted by the cyberforensics team just hours prior, was read aloud into the task force's operational log, its flat, inventory-like phrasing chilling the air of the command trailer, assessor matrix integrated into Civic Center alignment. Foundation locked. Friction point reduced to zero. The news of Albright's identification hit the state capitol with the force of an institutional earthquake. The local narrative for 35 years, heavily promoted by political campaigns that Vance's corporate entities had financed, was that Albright had abandoned his family and fled to a non-extradition territory to escape an impending internal audit for municipal embezzlement. The discovery of his remains within the very foundation of the building where he had worked turned that narrative into a grotesque, calculated fabrication. The realization that their civic institutions had been used as the active tools and permanent graves for anyone who challenged Vance's infrastructure monopoly broke the remaining psychological fabric of the entire valley. Inside the high-security interrogation module of the Capitol Correctional Facility, the atmosphere had reached a state of frozen, absolute psychological warfare. Leonard Vance sat with his hands anchored to the metal table, his physical frame unyielding, his face a cold, expressionless mask of stone that refused to mirror the structural collapse of his empire. The prosecutors did not present him with charts or digital files. They placed a physical artifact on the metal surface between them, a rusted, silver fountain pen that had been recovered from the vest pocket of Thomas Albright's preserved clothing inside the canister. The pen bore the engraved initials of the county assessment office, its nib still stained with the blue ink of the last property valuation report Albright had signed before he walked out into the winter fog of 1991. The lead prosecutor leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a hard, clinical whisper that cut through the low hiss of the room's ventilation unit. "We breached the Civic Center shear wall at noon, Leonard. The pathology match on Albright is already locked into the state server. Your defense network's motion for a federal venue change was summarily denied by the circuit court 30 minutes ago. You are no longer fighting a criminal trial. You are facing an absolute institutional exhumation. We have the financial records showing that every single pound of industrial concrete used to seal that basement was paid for through your corporate accounts under falsified stabilization manifests. The chain of custody is unbroken. The science is absolute, and your empire of silence has completely dissolved. Tell us about the bridge project from '95, Leonard. Tell us how many more people are holding up the transit network." Vance did not look down at the pen. His eyes remained fixed on the prosecutor with a flat, predatory focus that carried the absolute arrogance of 4 decades of successful evasion. He adjusted his glasses with a slow, deliberate movement of his left hand, his breathing maintaining a slow, rhythmic pace that defied the chemical and physical devastation of the evidence. You speak of these names with the provincial sentiment of an amateur historian, Counselor, Vance whispered, his voice dry, sharp, and entirely steady. You look at Thomas Albright, and you see a victim. I looked at the regional development map, and I saw a structural failure. In 1991, this county was on the precipice of total economic exclusion. The Federal Transport Authority was preparing to route the commercial rail link entirely around our valley because Albright was tying up the land acquisition parcels in frivolous, short-sighted valuation disputes. He wanted to preserve an abandoned agricultural field at the expense of an industrial distribution network that would employ 10,000 people. He was an impediment to the design. I removed the friction from the gears. I integrated the liability into the asset so that the community could build its future on a predictable, profitable foundation. The very building your task force is drilling into right now was paid for by the commerce that RailLink brought into this valley. You are living in a world that my engineering made possible. The sheer, clinical detachment of his justification sent a physical shudder through the state profilers watching from behind the two-way mirror. Vance had so completely internalized the logic of unchecked industrial development and corporate efficiency that he truly viewed the systematic execution of human beings as a legitimate form of administrative optimization, a routine site-clearing operation necessary to secure the progress of his kingdom. He did not operate out of a hidden compulsion or a chaotic rage. He operated as a structural auditor who cleared the ground of debris, treating the extraction of human lives with the same cold, geometric precision he used to plan his shipping routes. The legal counteroffensive from Vance's corporate attorneys deployed with an aggressive, desperate velocity within the hour. Realizing that the discovery of Albright's remains had rendered their technical arguments about DNA degradation entirely obsolete, they filed an extraordinary 300-page emergency petition with the state Supreme Court, demanding the immediate suspension of all state forensic exhumations and the total lockdown of the Central Command databases. They argued that the task force was utilizing speculative, unconstitutional digital forensics and that the implementation of the state's public safety emergency acts was a political conspiracy designed to liquidate Vance's corporate assets without due process of law. But the momentum of the state's prosecution was now backed by a total, non-negotiable political and public mandate that could not be checked by procedural maneuvers. The state Supreme Court issued an absolute, summary denial of the defense's petition within 90 minutes, stating that the unique, systemic nature of the alleged crimes demanded that the adjudication occur within the exact jurisdiction that had been subverted. The governor signed a secondary executive order placing the entirety of Vance's family foundation and its auxiliary real estate holdings under a permanent state receivership, converting his millions of dollars in frozen capital into a specialized fund dedicated to financing the complete forensic audit of every bridge support, highway ramp, and municipal foundation constructed in the valley since 1982. As the afternoon light faded behind the northern ridge, casting a cold, purple shadow across the valley, the physical scale of that forensic audit expanded with a terrifying, visible density. A convoy of White Department of Transportation engineering vehicles, equipped with high-intensity ground-penetrating radar arrays and deep-bore soil sampling drills, took up positions along the perimeter of the Route 9 pedestrian bridge, a massive concrete structure that Vance's company had completed in the spring of 1995. The area was completely surrounded by armed state troopers, the yellow crime scene tape wrapping around the concrete pillars like a synthetic shroud. The entire county had been transformed into an active, subterranean crime scene, a geological puzzle where every layer of pavement and every structural column was viewed through a lens of profound, sickening suspicion. Inside his quiet study 3 states away, Detective Miller sat under the pale light of his desk lamp, his eyes fixed on the digital telemetry files that continued to stream onto his monitors from the task force's Central Command server. He looked at his own handwritten field notes from December 1991, remembering the weeks he had spent interviewing Albright's colleagues, checking the regional airport logs, and searching the banks of the frozen river, completely blind to the fact that the property assessor had never left the building, that his remains had been sealed into the very foundation walls where Miller had filed the original missing persons report. The crushing, hollow weight in his chest was accompanied by a deep, institutional horror. Vance hadn't succeeded by operating as an invisible phantom in the woods. He had succeeded because he was integrated into the very architecture of the town's survival, using the civic progress of the valley as the ultimate, impenetrable camouflage for his atrocities. The state's cyberforensics unit completed their secondary extraction of the mainframe's encrypted communication histories at midnight, uncovering a series of digital logs from 1995 that detailed Vance's monitoring of the local police department's early digitization efforts. He had used his position on the Infrastructure Council to select the specific hardware and network protocols utilized by the precinct, ensuring that his private security systems had an active, real-time backdoor into the police data grids. He knew exactly what the detectives were looking at, what tips were being submitted through the anonymous hotlines, and how to alter his transport schedules to ensure that any potential lead was systematically neutralized before it could reach the state database. He had built a fortress of digital security that was as thick, non-porous, and unyielding as the concrete slabs he poured over his victims. As the sixth night of the continuous operation descended upon Blackwood Creek, the high-pitched, mechanical hum of the subterranean sensors along Route 9 continued without interruption, a steady, vibrating pulse that seemed to mirror the anxious, hypervigilant breathing of the population. The town was standing in the center of a total institutional collapse, its government dissolved, its corporate structures liquidated, and its collective history exposed as an engineered deception. The cold case from 1988 had been cracked. The suspect was finally in cuffs, but the exhumation of the valley was a process that was just beginning. A long, agonizing march toward a truth that would either cleanse the ground or leave the town a permanent monument to a monster's empire of ice. The task force did not pause for the changing of the dates. The investigation had become an absolute, self-sustaining machine that was currently grinding Vance's corporate legacy into fine dust. At 3 a.m., the ground-penetrating radar units operating at the Route 9 bridge site detected a secondary structural anomaly beneath the northern support pillar, a localized density variation within the deep-bore concrete pilings that listed on the original 1995 engineering manifests as a structural ballast adjustment. The technical terminology was another calculated lie that had survived for 31 years, a legal fiction designed to allow Vance's construction crews to inject custom-fabricated containment cells directly into the primary load-bearing infrastructure of the state transit network. The heavy-duty demolition teams moved into position under the glare of mobile floodlights, their concrete drills cutting through the frozen air of the ridge as they initiated the physical breach of the pillar. Each cut of the diamond-tipped blades was a literal tearing away of the pavement that had covered the truth, a slow, mechanical exhumation that was drawing closer with every passing minute to the final, hidden chapters of Leonard Vance's calculations. The air grew thick with the sharp, acrid scent of ozone and crushed aggregate, a visceral reminder that the ground can hold a secret for a lifetime, but that eventually the earth always speaks, and when it does, it demands a reckoning that no amount of institutional silence can ever turn away. Inside the tech trailers, the analysts were already cross-referencing the corporate manifests from the spring of 1995, mapping the exact dates of the concrete pour to the missing persons databases of the surrounding 3 counties. They were finding that the timeline followed a chilling, predictable trajectory, matching the sudden disappearance of an independent structural engineer who had refused to sign off on the bridge's environmental impact reports. The pattern was absolute. The methodology was unassailable. Vance had converted the very bones of the county's transit system into the permanent vault of his execution logs, turning the infrastructure of progress into a multi-decade monument to his own absolute power. The legal machinery of the state was now moving with a velocity that could not be checked by technical motions or corporate injunctions. The grand jury was called into an extraordinary morning session at the Capitol, the prosecutors delivering the physical links, the custom nozzle specifications, the weight certificates, and the cryptographic log signatures directly to the panel under a tight, high-security protocol. The indictment that was emerging was a document of unprecedented scope, a literal blueprint of an institutional conspiracy that had successfully hijacked the legal and physical infrastructure of a county for nearly 40 years. The cold case was no longer a historical file sitting in a dusty drawer. It had become an active, breathing engine of state retribution, an absolute machine that was preparing to crush the fortress that Leonard Vance had spent his entire life constructing in the dark. As the sun rose over the eastern ridge, casting a cold, amber light across the valley, the high-pitched hum of the subterranean sensors along Route 9 continued without interruption, a mechanical pulse that seemed to mirror the anxious, hypervigilant breathing of the population. The town was standing on the precipice of a total institutional collapse, its government dissolved, its economy frozen, and its collective history exposed as an engineered deception. The cold case from 1988 had been cracked, the suspect was finally in cuffs, but the exhumation of the valley was a process that was just beginning, a long, agonizing march toward a truth that would either cleanse the ground or leave the town a permanent monument to a monster's empire of ice. The next phase of the forensic excavation inside the Civic Center cellar was scheduled to breach the primary seal of the shear wall at noon. The task force had already brought in specialized drainage equipment and chemical containment arrays, fully aware that the atmosphere inside the vault would be an industrial hazard, a localized time capsule holding the molecular remnants of a 35-year-old horror story. The investigators moved with a grim, solemn determination, their faces hardening with every step they took into the damp gloom of the basement. They knew they were not just recovering bodies. They were executing an institutional audit of a monster's soul, a slow, mechanical process that would not stop until every square inch of Leonard Vance's empire had been brought into the cold, unforgiving light of the truth. The deep vibration of the drills against the bridge support felt like a constant, localized tremor that shook the windows of the nearby residential sectors. People stood on their porches in the early morning cold, their eyes fixed on the flashing blue and white lights that lined the highway. They did not speak. The time for rumors and theories had passed, replaced by a cold, numbing certainty that their entire lives had been lived on top of a carefully managed graveyard. The sense of security they had prized, the clean streets, the modern infrastructure, the economic stability that had made Blackwood Creek the envy of the region, was revealed to be the decorative lid of a multi-decade containment system. Inside the command trailer, the lead detective stood over the digital mapping table, his face drawn into a tight mask of exhaustion. He looked at the flashing red icons that marked the verified anomalies across the county grid. Each icon was a site where Leonard Vance's construction companies had poured reinforced concrete under an emergency infrastructure grant. The map looked less like a corporate development plan and more like a tactical grid of a military occupation, with Vance sitting at the center, tracking the optimization of his space with the clinical coldness of an algorithm. He didn't just hide the evidence, the detective whispered, his fingers tracing the line of Route 9. He built the county out of it. He turned the entire population into his accomplices by making us drive over his crimes every single day to get to work. He made his atrocities permanent by making them necessary to the survival of the town's economy. The legal battle in the capital was now transitioning into a total scorched earth strategy. The state attorney general filed a secondary brief under the Public Anti-Corruption Acts, moving to permanently seize all financial assets tied to Vance's personal estate, his logistics firm, and his family foundation anywhere in the world. The brief argued that because the entire wealth of the Vance empire had been derived from the systematic manipulation of municipal contracts and the violent suppression of regulatory oversight, every dollar in his possession was an active instrument of a continuous criminal enterprise. The move was designed to completely decapitate his defense network, stripping his high-priced corporate attorneys of their funding and forcing the case into an immediate, high-velocity trial that would not allow for decades of technical appeals. Vance's chief counsel tried to launch a final, desperate appeal through the federal district court, claiming that the state's asset liquidation strategy was a violation of constitutional protections against excessive fines and premature seizures. But the federal judge was unyielding, issuing a summary denial within 45 minutes of the filing. In her statement, which was broadcast live across the regional news networks, she noted that when a corporate infrastructure is alleged to have been used to manufacture and conceal mass murder, the state possesses not only the right but the absolute civic obligation to freeze and examine every single component of that network to protect the integrity of the ground itself. As the sun reached its apex over the valley, casting a sharp, White glare across the concrete pillars of the Route 9 bridge. The demolition crews completed their preliminary penetration of the northern support piling. The sensors inside the drill shafts recorded a sudden drop in resistance, indicating that the diamond-tipped bits had breached the outer 4 inches of industrial aggregate and entered the hollow, synthetic lining of the hidden containment cell. The atmosphere inside the shaft immediately changed, the air scrubbers registering a sharp spike in the chemical indicators, the distinct molecular signature of nitrogen gas and rubberized marine sealant that had remained locked in the dark since the spring of 1995. The forensic teams moved in with high-resolution fiber-optic cameras, lower down into the dark core of the pillar to capture the first internal images of Vance's final repository. The video feed, streaming in real time onto the monitors in the command trailer, showed a perfectly preserved, custom-welded steel cylinder, its surface immaculate, completely untouched by the natural filtration of groundwater or the shifting pressure of the surrounding stone. The label on the cylinder, etched into the metal with a custom-machined stamp, read simply, "Transit Alignment, Pillar 1, Complete." The match was absolute. The methodology was unbroken. The cold case from 1988 had been cracked. The suspect was in heavy steel cuffs, but the physical exhumation of Leonard Vance's empire was a process that was rewriting the very geography of the valley, a relentless, mechanical march toward a truth that would leave the town permanently altered, standing in the cold and unforgiving light of a reality that could never be covered by concrete again. The fiber-optic camera feed streaming from the hollowed core of Pillar 1 didn't just illuminate the dark interior of the Route 9 bridge support, it cast a blinding, digital glare onto the entire history of the valley's mid-90s expansion. In the central command trailer, the silence was total, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans on the high-definition monitors. The image on the screens was crystal clear, a custom-welded steel cylinder, completely uncorroded, looking as if it had been sealed inside the concrete casing only yesterday rather than 3 decades ago. The custom-machined stamp, "Transit Alignment, Pillar 1, Complete," stared back at the investigators like a cold, iron signature. By 2 p.m., the tactical perimeter around the bridge had grown to include a full hazardous materials extraction unit. The State Department of Transportation had closed Route 9 indefinitely, diverting all regional commercial traffic onto the secondary northern state routes. The valley was effectively split in two, its primary economic artery severed by the forensic exhumation of its own foundations. Heavy-duty hydraulic crane arrays, anchored to reinforced steel plates driven deep into the ridge soil, were positioned over the pillar, their massive cables swaying slowly in the freezing wind. The technical challenge was unprecedented. The engineers had to extract the hidden canister without compromising the structural integrity of a bridge that carried 40,000 vehicles a day. While the engineering teams were stabilizing the bridge infrastructure, the task force's data analysts were completing a deep-dive audit of the corporate correspondence from the spring of 1995. They had recovered a secondary archive of encrypted internal memos from a legacy server room hidden within Vance's private machine shop at the Ridge Lodge. The files detailed the exact timeline of the bridge construction, mapping the dates of the concrete pours to a series of highly classified regulatory disputes. The documents showed that in March 1995, an independent structural engineer named Richard Bowen, who had been contracted by the state to review the valley's highway expansion projects, had refused to sign off on the foundation specifications for Route 9. Bowen had noted in his field logs that the geological assessments for the bridge pilings had been artificially modified, masking a significant pocket of unstable river silt that threatened the long-term safety of the structure. He had threatened to take his findings directly to the Federal Highway Authority, a move that would have permanently frozen tens of millions of dollars in state development grants and effectively bankrupt Vance Logistics' primary expansion model. The decrypted ledger entries inside Vance's directory recorded the resolution of this regulatory crisis with a cold, administrative calculation of a manufacturing firm optimization report. An entry dated April 3, 1995, at 2:14 a.m., read simply, "Ballast adjustment authorized for Pillar 1. Engineering friction reduced to absolute zero. Manifest locked." Bowen had filed his final report on a Friday afternoon. He had vanished before the office opened on Monday morning. The local narrative at the time, propagated by newspaper articles that Vance's foundation funded, was that Bowen had cracked under the professional pressure of the massive state project, abandoned his credentials, and vanished into Canada to escape a messy divorce. The physical reality cowering inside Pillar One tore that fabrication to shreds. The forensic technicians, utilizing specialized diamond-tipped core drills and hydraulic extraction sleeves, managed to pull the steel cylinder free from the concrete matrix at 4:30 p.m. The canister was immediately transferred into a pressurized, negative airflow containment trailer for opening. When the automated seal breakers breached the primary weld line under the white glare of forensic lamps, the air monitors registered the identical chemical signature that had become the trademark of Leonard Vance's work: a high-pressure injection of pure nitrogen gas, heavily mixed with an industrial polymer grout and rubberized marine sealant. The state pathology unit completed the biological verification within 90 minutes, matching the dental records and old medical files of Richard Bowen with a forensic absolute that left the defense network with zero legal maneuvering room. Inside the canister, alongside the remains, the technicians recovered Bowen's state engineering credentials, his silver structural caliper, and his handwritten field notebook containing the original, unedited geological data that proved Vance's construction companies had compromised the safety of the highway to secure their infrastructure monopoly. Vance hadn't just murdered a man. He had buried the proof of his own corporate fraud directly inside the very structure that the fraud had compromised. The news of Bowen's identification and the exposure of the structural deception behind the Route 9 bridge caused a wave of institutional panic to sweep through the state regulatory agencies. The governor called an extraordinary emergency session of the state legislature at the Capitol, demanding the immediate passage of the Subterranean Asset Preservation and Forensic Accountability Act. The emergency legislation stripped all private infrastructure contractors of their corporate anonymity, mandating a total, retroactive geological and digital audit of every commercial project executed within the state over a 40-year span. The valley was no longer just a crime scene. It had become the epicenter of a massive regulatory purge that was systematically dismantling the legacy of privatization that had defined the region's growth since the early 80s. Inside the high-security interrogation module, the lead prosecutor did not approach the table with files or printouts. He brought a high-resolution digital tablet displaying the live video feed of the Route 9 bridge excavation. He placed the screen directly in front of Leonard Vance, allowing the images of the extracted cylinder and Richard Bowen's silver caliper to flash against the suspect's glasses. "Pillar 1 is empty, Leonard," the prosecutor said, his voice a hard, level instrument that carried the weight of 4 separate capital homicides. The pathology match on Richard Bowen was entered into the federal server 20 minutes ago. "We have his field notebook showing exactly how your company falsified the structural reports to secure the 95 expansion grant. Your defense lawyers are currently sitting in the Capitol cafeteria, realizing that their arguments about circumstantial evidence have completely disintegrated. The state Supreme Court has just authorized the absolute, non-parolable freeze of every single offshore trust asset associated with your name. You are no longer a civic leader defending a corporate legacy. You are a bankrupt prisoner waiting for a federal death warrant. Tell us about the reservoir expansion from '98, Leonard. Tell us who else is holding up the valley's utility network." Vance did not look away from the screen. His posture remained as rigid and imperial as if he were still presiding over the Regional Infrastructure Council. He adjusted his glasses with a slow, deliberate movement of his hand, his breathing maintaining its slow, mechanical rhythm, completely unbothered by the absolute exposure of his methodology. "You continue to evaluate these files through the microscopic lens of a criminal court, counselor," Vance whispered, his voice dry, sharp, and entirely steady. "You look at Richard Bowen and you see a victim of violence. I looked at the regional transit grid and I saw an intellectual defect. Bowen was an academic who believed that an ideal engineering theory could override the economic survival of an entire county. If I had allowed his refusal to sign off on those pilings to delay that bridge project for even a month, the logistics corridor would have been permanently rerouted through the Northern Valley. This entire community would have been starved of industrial investment. The businesses would have closed, The tax base would have dried up, and the very schools your children attend would be empty shells today. I balanced the equation. I took an unstable, disruptive variable out of the system and integrated it into the structural ballast of the infrastructure itself. The citizens of this valley have been driving over that bridge for 30 years, building their lives, their businesses, and their wealth on top of the stability that my calculation provided. You are all consumers of my engineering. The absolute, clinical detachment of his philosophy sent a cold wave of dread through the task force profilers watching from behind the two-way mirror. Vance had so thoroughly stripped his crimes of moral context that he truly viewed the systematic execution and structural integration of human beings as a legitimate, high-level form of resource allocation, a necessary corporate correction designed to secure the predictable progression of his kingdom. He wasn't hiding from the light. He was actively challenging the state to prove that its laws were more vital to the survival of the community than the physical infrastructure he had built out of the bones of his victims. The legal counteroffensive from Vance's corporate network was now a chaotic, fragmented retreat. Realizing that the federal courts had blocked every attempt to suppress the legacy mainframe logs and the forensic pathological data, his defense attorneys launched a desperate, last-ditch effort to claim that Vance's physical frailty and advanced age rendered him medically unfit to endure the upcoming high-velocity trial. They submitted a massive, 400-page medical report claiming that his respiratory dependency and advanced cardiovascular degeneration made a continuous courtroom presentation a direct threat to his life, attempting to force the court into an indefinite medical suspension that would outlast the public fury. But the state attorney general was already prepared for the maneuver. Working in tandem with the Federal Civil Rights Division, she brought in a panel of independent, military-grade medical examiners who conducted an extraordinary 4-hour assessment of Vance's cognitive and physical capacities inside his secure cell. The examiner's report, delivered to the judge at midnight, was absolute. While Vance's physical body was failing under the natural progression of age, his cognitive functions, his spatial memory, and his analytical reasoning were operating at a level that matched a senior executive in peak operational condition. He wasn't incompetent. He was sharp, calculating, and fully aware of every move on the legal board, hiding behind the mechanical hiss of his oxygen machine in a final, calculated attempt to outwait the clock of state retribution. The judge issued an immediate, summary order setting the trial date for the following Monday, denying any further medical or procedural delays. In her public decree, she noted that when a citizen is accused of converting the physical infrastructure of a state into a private, multi-decade burial ground, the court possesses an absolute, non-negotiable obligation to prioritize the swift execution of justice over corporate convenience or medical comfort. The venue was locked down. The jury selection was accelerated under a high-security anonymity protocol, and the state prepared for a legal presentation that would systematically lay bare the entire internal machinery of Leonard Vance's empire of ice. As the pretrial night descended over Blackwood Creek, the physical scale of the state's presence reached a density that felt less like a police investigation and more like a total military occupation. A convoy of white State Police Command vehicles and Department of Transportation drilling rigs took up permanent positions along the perimeter of the regional water reservoir, a massive utility complex that Vance's company had expanded in the autumn of 1998. The area was surrounded by triple-layered steel barricades, the floodlights illuminating the dark water with a harsh, white glare that burned through the valley fog. The entire county had been transformed into a sprawling, multi-layered archaeological excavation site, a geological puzzle where every layer of pavement, every structural piling, and every drop of water was viewed through a lens of profound, terrifying suspicion. Inside his quiet study 3 states away, Detective Miller sat in absolute silence, the pale amber light of his single desk lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the maps of the valley that covered his walls. He looked at his own handwritten logs from the spring of 1995, remembering the weeks he had spent searching the northern logging camps for Richard Bowen's vehicle, completely blind to the fact that the structural engineer had never left the highway, that his remains had been sealed into the very concrete column that Miller drove past every single morning during his daily commute to the precinct. The crushing weight of the failure was accompanied by a deep, absolute realization. Vance hadn't succeeded by hiding in the shadows of the margins. He had succeeded because he was the very platform upon which the safe, comfortable reality of the valley was built. He had converted the entire population into unwitting participants in his crimes, transforming the infrastructure of progress into a permanent, multi-decade monument to his own absolute power. The state's cyberforensics unit completed their final extraction of the mainframe's encrypted utility directories at midnight, uncovering a series of digital logs from 1998 that demonstrated Vance had been utilizing his control over the Regional Water Board to systematically manipulate the groundwater filtration records. He had installed a private network of chemical injection ports near his storage facilities, ensuring that any localized signature of the polymer sealants or lime compounds was chemically neutralized before it could reach the state monitoring stations. He had built a fortress of environmental security that was as thick, non-porous, and calculated as the reinforced concrete foundations he poured over his victims. As the seventh night of the continuous operation closed its grip on the valley, the high-pitched hum of the subterranean sensors along the reservoir perimeter continued without interruption, a steady, mechanical pulse that seemed to mirror the anxious, hypervigilant breathing of the population. The town was standing in the center of an absolute institutional collapse, its local governance entirely suspended, its corporate structures liquidated by state decree, and its collective history exposed as a managed deception. The cold case from 1988 had been cracked. The suspect was finally in heavy steel cuffs, but the exhumation of Leonard Vance's empire was a process that was just reaching its most critical and terrifying acceleration point. Relentless, mechanical march toward a truth that would leave the town permanently altered, standing in the cold, clear, and unforgiving light of a reality that could never be covered by concrete again.